Good morning. Are we on now? Okay, thank you very much. Welcome to this book launch of Latin American Foreign Policies in the New World Order, edited by Jorge Jaime, Carlos Fontin, and Carlos Omiani. I will now call on the Acting Director of the Institute of International Relations to open a few remarks. Anita.
Thank you very much, Chair. Ms. Rita Toussaint, Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Winston Dukaran, Professor of Practice at the Institute of International Relations and former Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Today's guest of honor and co-editor of the book being launched today, Professor Jorge Jaime, members of the Diplomatic Corps, specially invited guests, distinguished speakers, colleagues, attendees, students, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is an esteemed honor to welcome you and bring remarks on the occasion of the launch of the book, Latin American Foreign Policies in the New World Order, the Active Non-Alignment Option. This piece of work is very timely for both Latin America and the Caribbean, as the world plunges into turmoil, economic and other crises deepen, severely impacting Latin America and the Caribbean regions. As we know, as in the past, these regions have not contributed to these circumstances, yet we find ourselves being central to the implications. In the midst of all these developments, Latin America and the Caribbean are being asked, or at least expected, to take sides in economic and political tensions and conflicts between the big and powerful players. At this juncture, it is absolutely imperative to give consideration to strategies which will not serve the interests of others at the expense of the development and advancement of Latin American and Caribbean regions and their peoples. It is important to not only think about the policy response to non-alignment, but also how to tactically go about implementing in a manner that will advance Latin American, Caribbean external, international relationships and engagements for consolidating our development priorities. I therefore wish to congratulate the editors of this important volume and all the contributing authors for the intellectual innovation in relation to the main agenda and ideas put forward in this book. Thank you, Professor Jaime, for the opportunity to collaborate with you on this launch and discussion this morning. I very much look forward to your presentation. Deepest gratitude to Mr. Dukaran for spearheading the organization of this launch with the support of Ms. Michelle Siraj and the staff of the Institute of International Relations Secretariat. Thank you, Ms. Toussaint, for your presence, taking the time to bring remarks and for your support. I look forward to your comments on the matters under discussion, which are so important to Trinidad and Tobago at this time. I wish to publicly express my own personal and IR's appreciation to Senator the Honorable Dr. Amory Brown for his warm friendship, guidance, and unwavering support of the work and operations of the Institute of International Relations at this very critical moment in our history. Thank you to our distinguished chair, Professor Anthony Bryan, who has taken the time to moderate this morning's proceedings. I'm indeed very pleased that you have agreed to perform this role, Professor Bryan. Thank you for remaining very connected to the IAR. At this time, I wish to express thanks to all the speakers and presenters, Dr. Jacqueline LaGuardia Martinez and Dr. Anthony Gonzalez. Special thanks to His Excellency David Francisco Malaga for proposing a toast for this event. I would like to thank our specially invited guests who accepted this invitation, both in person here in this room and those who are online. Thank you for your interest in this event and the Institute of International Relations. You are deeply appreciated. Thank you for coming. I would like to acknowledge all attendees who have taken the time to tune into this and other events hosted by the IAR. We thank you for the role you play in advancing the public profile of the IAR and the policy relevance of our work. Thank you, everyone. Here's wishing us a productive discussion and successful program. Thank you very much. Over to you, Chair.
Well, my name is Anthony Bryan. I directed this institute for almost 10 years, in the last century, I might add. And thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. And actually, at my age, I'm very pleased to be anywhere. So this is indeed an honor. And before getting into the formal program, let me say hello to my longtime friend, Jorge Heine. We go back at least almost 40 years, Jorge. Don't give away your age. But before I go on, let me thank all of you for coming. I'm not going to go through the protocol, all protocols observed. Thank you very much. What I would want to do is to issue a special thanks to the ambassadors who have come. Ambassador Melendez of Mexico, David Malaga of Peru, Sanchez Cordero of Venezuela, Gisela Anjubo from Argentina, Dr. Lancelot Cowie, our former ambassador to Cuba, tells me he's no longer active. So, Mr. Jose Cisterna, Charge d'Affaires of the Ambassador of Chile, who will join by Zoom, I understand. And did the Ambassador of the Dominican Republic come? No, he's not. Okay, very good. Thank you very much. También me gustaría dar la bienvenida a los miembros del cuerpo diplomático de los países de América Latina que nos han acompañado hoy aquí en el instituto, así como por Zoom. Bienvenidos, Excelencia. It is my pleasure to open this session and to ask Miss Rita Toussaint, who is the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs in Trinidad, to give a few remarks on behalf of the Minister. Minister Brown was unable to join us. I'm sure Ms. Toussaint will explain.
Professor.
Is it on?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. Sadly, I am very much entrenched in the protocol. Your Excellency, David Malaga, Ambassador of Peru, Your Excellency, Alvaro Sanchez Cordero, Ambassador of Venezuela, Your Excellency, Ambassador Victor Hugo Morales, Mexico, Sir, my former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Winston Ducaran, and Professor in service, colleagues from the Embassy of Argentina, Ms. Ain Hibnob, and Ms. Gomez from the Embassy of the Dominican Republic. Dr. Montoute, we're becoming fast friends. Good morning. Dr. Cowie, our guest of honor, Professor Jorge Heine, Dr. Gonzalez, my former lecturer when I was here at the Institute, other esteemed guests and participants, good morning. I am here today due to the unavoidable absence of Senator the Honorable Dr. Amy Brown, Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs of Trinidad and Tobago, who has traveled to New York officially to participate in the launch of Trinidad and Tobago's campaign for the presidency of the 78th session of the United Nations General Assembly. I'm seeing nods and smiles, so I'm sure there's support there, and thank you very much. So it gives me great pleasure to bring to you, Ministers, warm greetings on this very important occasion. I know that he would have wanted to be here himself, but of course, duty called him away from Trinidad and Tobago. Allow me to begin, please, by commending the Institute of International Relations for hosting this event. It certainly reflects the Institute's commitment to enhancing the Caribbean perspective on 21st century diplomacy and the contemporary issues that shape the geopolitical landscape. And if you would permit me just a little time to say a little something about the Institute, I don't know if I'll have an opportunity. Institute of International Relations, for me, remains an indelible and key stakeholder in our national and regional development. Its distinguished leadership continues to bring awareness to current issues in the regional and international arenas, which serves to assist the Caribbean in facing the issues of the day and to challenge conventional thinking. And I think this book launch certainly highlights that approach. In fact, the Institute's reach and influence are wider than many might imagine. Many who have graduated from this institute have used their academic experience here as a grounding for the pursuit of higher learning and for contribution to the development of the region, including in leadership positions. And I would say including ambassadors, other diplomats, researchers, members of the judiciary, permanent secretaries, and the head of state and foreign ministers. So the work of the Institute has been and continues to be pertinent and very effective in helping to shape the future of the region. The Institute has clearly made and continues to make an immutable contribution to and positive impact on the region. For this, we are most grateful. Turning to the reason for our gathering today, I think we can all agree that we live in unprecedented times in a constantly shifting operational environment with respect to global events. I am therefore intrigued by the publication being launched today, Latin American Foreign Policies in the New World Order, the Active Non-Alignment Option, a collaboration of 3 distinguished Chileans whose combined experience in government, politics, diplomacy, and academia would make this publication a significant interest for academics and practitioners alike. Certainly, I'm interested. I'm especially pleased to see Professor Jorge Heine among the editors and contributors to this book, as I recall the critical role that you, Professor, and former Minister and Professor Winston Ducaran, who is also among us today, played in launching the Diplomatic Academy of the Caribbean in May 2014 at the University Inn on this campus. This book is being launched at a point in time when the world is in a state of flux due to constant changes in the geopolitical landscape. These global developments require countries to take stock and re-examine priorities, alliances, and strategies in the conduct of their international relations. The book addresses the themes of active non-alignment and acquiescence as they relate to international relations. These topics are relevant in light of the escalating conflict in various parts of the world and the constant need for countries to adjust their foreign policies and their foreign policy strategies to the global realities as they pursue their international interests. In the case of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, it is unswerving in its stance on respecting the sovereignty and sovereign equality of all states. Our foreign policy further upholds the tenets of non-interference in the internal affairs of other states and respect and adherence to international law and the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. This foreign policy orientation serves as a springboard for engagement on all levels with its diverse partners in the hemisphere and globally. Bilaterally, we have diplomatic relations with the majority of independent countries around the world, experiencing active bilateral agendas with countries across the globe. In the regional and multilateral arena, we have endeavored to pursue avenues for collaboration with our neighbors in the region through our shared membership in numerous regional mechanisms. I don't need to name them. I think we all know them. Among them, ACS, CELAC, most recently. OAS, just to name a few. While I am not sure Trinidad and Tobago's approach qualifies as active non-alignment, and perhaps it does. In everything we do, national development and our citizens' welfare are of the utmost priority. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the Institute of International Relations for the invitation to participate in such an undertaking to shed light on future considerations for leaders of the region. Professor Heine, I anticipate that your participation today will provide more insight into the thought processes and critical theories that support the content of your latest academic offering. It is my sincere hope that it will inspire constructive dialogue and future research on the themes raised. I am confident that the region will continue to succeed if we can maintain the intellectual rigor that the Institute supports and promotes, to continue pushing our boundaries as nations, seeking a better and sustainable future for all. Congratulations to you, Professor Heine, to the Institute, and your collaborators on the launch of this book. Thank you.
Mr. Stan, my apologies. Before I go on, let me acknowledge the presence, either online or personal, of my longtime friend, Winston Ducaran. Very long-time friend. I mean, we don't want to go back too much, but you know, we've been friends and colleagues for decades. Let me also acknowledge Dr. Anthony Gonzalez, again, my longtime colleague here at the Institute of International Relations, and Dr. Jacqueline LaGuardia Martinez from Cuba, who is lecturer here. Let me make a few comments. First of all, I think we all have access to Ambassador Jorge Heine's biography. Just a quick capsule. He's a lawyer, international relations scholar, and a diplomat. Currently a research professor at the Frederick Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. And prior to that, he was a public policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. He served as ambassador of Chile to China 2014 to 2017, to India in 2003 to 2007, and to South Africa 1994 to 1999. He's one of those who made the transition from academia to politics very smoothly, serving as a cabinet minister in the Chilean government. In addition to that, his academic accomplishments are many. He's the author, of course, of, I think, something like 17 books, of which this is probably the latest. Let me acknowledge for his interest always in the Institute of International Relations, and furthermore, in the Caribbean. When we started off as colleagues decades ago, I thought of him as a Caribbeanist. That is what he was. He understood small state diplomacy. He understood the history. We hopscotch all over the Caribbean, if you recall. You were in Puerto Rico at the time, I think, and we just moved around. And that interest was always there. So that to see that he has now picked up, as it were, a mantle concerning active non-alignment is not surprising. It's not surprising because he understood the non-alignment movement. He understood also that our nations in the Caribbean were non-aligned. We may have been active in the non-aligned movement, but there's a slight difference. And I think that is what this book is going to try to bring out. Because some of the region's leading analysts and foreign policy makers are arguing that non-alignment or active non-alignment is the path to follow if the region is to realize its full potential and to occupy its rightful place in the concert of nations. It is something that I think we would welcome. A fairly lengthy discourse, obviously, by Ambassador Jorge Heine. and as I say, a friend of the Institute. And I would like to emphasize the point that was made by Ms. Toussaint in the delivery of the minister's remarks. This is an invaluable institution. It cannot be allowed to die. Must remain. It has trained most of the region's diplomats. I would have the record, as with Dr. Gonzalez, of having trained a majority of the region's diplomats during our career here. So as strongly as I could urge, and certainly I make an appeal to the diplomatic community and to others out there, that this is a formidable institution. It is one of the best in the developing world, and it should be as strongly supported by governments and others as is possible. Having said that, let me now ask our esteemed guest, Jorge, to make a presentation concerning the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Bryan. And Your Excellencies, Mrs. Toussaint, Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of External Affairs of Trinidad, Professor Montut, Director of the Institute of International Relations, dear friends and colleagues, my good friend Winston Dukiran, gives me great pleasure to see you here at a distance from Boston. It is for me a great honor to be in such a distinguished company, and I much appreciate the presence of so many ambassadors who honor me with their presence at this launch. For me, as Professor Bryan said, who started his career, his academic career, in the Caribbean as a Caribbeanist, where I spent more than 15 years of my life in teaching in Puerto Rico. When Professor Bryan was director of the Institute of International Relations, I directed the CISCLA, the Caribbean Institute of Latin American Studies in Inter-American University of Puerto Rico. And we engaged in many joint ventures. We were partners in crime, as it were, and in some very exciting conferences. So for me, it is very special to be part of this event, going back to my roots, as it were. But let me zero in on the subject that brings us together today. And that is the issue of active non-alignment, and why has non-alignment come back with such force, almost with a vengeance, in the past few years. And that is what this book reflects. And let me start with a puzzle. I always tell my students that in political science, the most important thing is to define the problem. What is the question you are asking? Once you have done that, half the work is done. In this particular case, the puzzle that drives our concern is the following. Here you have a situation, the invasion of Ukraine, a sovereign state, by another, by Russia. Something that goes against, the basic principles of international law, the Charter of the United Nations, the principle of non-intervention and respect for the sovereignty of nations. And this, which has been almost universally condemned by many countries around the world, and particularly by European nations and North American nations, the G7, NATO members, and so on. Yet the reaction to this development has been very different in the North than in the South. Many Latin American nations that are very committed to upholding international law, to upholding the United Nations Charter, yet have refused to back the diplomatic and economic sanctions on Russia. Many have refused to support the suspension of Russia from the United Nations Human Rights Council. And most recently, we had a remarkable development in which the German Chancellor, Mr. Olaf Scholz, paid a visit to various South American countries, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, asking for weapons to be delivered, heavy weapons to be delivered by these countries to Ukraine. This had also been requested by the United States. Yet, this request was denied unanimously. And South American countries said they were not ready to become belligerents in this war, that they condemned the invasion, but that they were not ready to become belligerents and to take active part in this war. Now, the question then is, this is the puzzle we are addressing, why are Latin American countries not willing to go whole hog, as it were, in this, in siding with the G7, in siding with the NATO countries? And, you know, there have been various comments that have been made about this. Some have referred to this as a moral failure, that, you know, the leading countries in the region, like Argentina, like Mexico, like Brazil, have not sort of stepped up to the plate in such a decisive moment in history. Well, but other countries around the world have done something similar. I'm just back from South Africa, where I was last week attending a seminar on non-alignment. And South Africa has refused to do that as well and has abstained on a number of critical votes in the United Nations on this issue. I was in India about a month ago, and India has also refused to side with the G7 and with NATO. So has Indonesia, so have many other leading, Pakistan, many other leading democracies around the world. So the question arises, why is this the case? And this speaks to another issue that I find extraordinarily problematic. It has been said that the war in Ukraine represents the main cleavage in international affairs today, and that cleavage would be one between democracy and autocracy. That those that side with Ukraine embody democracy, those that do not represent autocracy. Well, that, you know, sounds very nice, but has really no bearing to reality. Some of the largest democracies in the world, like the ones I recently mentioned, Indonesia, India, South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, they are not standing with the G7. They are not standing with the NATO countries. They are refusing to make this European war into a global war. And the reason for this is not some sort of moral failure, as has been expressed by some commentators and columnists. This is because they are taking what we call an active non-alignment position. And here it is very important to distinguish between two things. One of them is whether you condemn, as many of these countries have, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. That is what, you know, most countries have in fact done. A very different proposition is to try to make this into a global war, to enlist the whole world into siding with Ukraine, providing it with weapons, sanctions against Russia. The only country in Latin America that has supported the sanctions, economic and diplomatic sanctions on Russia, is Costa Rica. No other country has done so, and for good reasons. You know, the Ukraine war is a tragic war, but so are all wars. The notion that this is because it is a European war, it should therefore be the business of the whole world, of, you know, all 200 countries around the world, that they should engage in warfare against Russia, a unique case in, you know, the history of humanity, doesn't resist analysis. This is a European war that should be solved by Europeans. There is no reason why the rest of the world should become part in such an exercise. And, you know, Foreign Minister of India, Dr. J. Shankar, you know, a remarkable statesman in so many ways. He has this wonderful phrase which sums up the situation, it seems to me, very nicely. What he said is, the time is long past in which Europe considered that Europe's problems were the world's problems, but the world's problems were not Europe's. And that, it seems to me, encapsulates very nicely what the situation in today's world is all about. Now, in that context, let me provide a bit of background to our book and how the arguments that we developed came about. Let me just mention, perhaps, obviously not all of you have read the book, but the book has chapters by 5 former Latin American foreign ministers from some of the leading countries in the region, including Celso Amorim, the former foreign minister of Brazil, who is now special advisor to President Lula, by Jorge Castañeda, the former Mexican foreign minister, by José Miguel Insulza, the former Chilean foreign minister and former OAS-SG, by Rafael Roncagliolo, former Peruvian foreign minister, and by the current defense minister of Argentina and former foreign minister Jorge Tayana. So what I'm saying is that this is not just an academic book. It also has the reflections and contributions from some of Latin America's most senior and experienced foreign policy makers that bring to bear their long-standing experience to this critical issue. And the book arose from an article we published with my colleagues, Fortin and Ominami, in Foreign Affairs Latin America, which is the Spanish edition of the Foreign Affairs Journal published in New York. This journal is published in Mexico. This was published in July of 2020. And the original impetus for this article came not from the war in Ukraine, which hadn't happened, obviously, but from the tensions between China and the United States in Latin America. We saw the region, and Trinidad, of course, has experienced this as well, as buffeted by the winds of this newly emerging second Cold War between the United States and China. In our country, we're being pressured to make decisions on business deals that had been struck with China, on infrastructure projects, on various investment projects, putting us in a very difficult situation. And let me give you a very specific example. This is not some sort of abstract theoretical discussion. Governments were forced to make decisions and cancel major projects that were badly needed because of this. I myself submitted to the Chinese government when I was serving in Beijing a project to install a fiber optic cable from Valparaiso to Shanghai. No internet cable crosses the South Pacific at this point in time. Many do so in the North Pacific and the North Atlantic, but none crosses the South Pacific. So there is no direct internet line communication between Asia and South America, which, if you think about it, is quite absurd. Well, the project was signed into an MOU between the Chilean and the Chinese government in 2016. A pre-feasibility study was undertaken. Later, there was a change of government. By 2019, Secretary of State Pompeo visited Chile, exercised strong pressure, and the project was canceled. So, this is not, again, an abstract discussion. This is something very concrete that is actually happening today, which led us to this notion that countries in the region could not be exposed to these pressure, that they should put their own interests front and center and not let themselves be pressured into taking decisions that were in the interest of the great powers and not in the interest of Latin American countries. So we put this together then into a collective volume, into an edited volume, published in Spanish in November of 2021. And we argued about an emerging Cold War and how this made non-alignment, active non-alignment that we call a key position in foreign affairs. Now, what are the distinct features of this position, and how does this differ from the traditional non-alignment, which Jawaharlal Nehru, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, famously described as not allowing yourself to become the plaything of others, in a famous phrase. There are a number of points, but one of the most important points here is the following. We live today in a very different age. The old third world of the 70s and 80s is no more. We live in the age of the new South. What do I mean by this? By this, I mean that today, the Asian giants, China and India, two countries where I've been fortunate enough to have been accredited as ambassador, are setting the pace for economic growth and development. The most dynamic region in the world today is no longer in the North Atlantic. It is in the Asia Pacific, in what the World Bank has called the wealth shift from the North Atlantic to the Asia Pacific. By 2050, it is projected that the top 3 economies in the world will be China, India, and the United States, in that order. That of the top 10 economies in the world, 7 will be non-Western. So we are moving towards a very different world. What my good friend and also one of the co-authors of the book, Oliver Stunkel, Brazilian analyst, has called a post-Western world. Much as the old third world rely on what is known as the diplomatie de carrière de doléances, that is basically sort of victimhood diplomacy, demanding reparations from the West, demanding transfers of resources from the West because of the exploitation that took place during colonial times. The new international economic order, as you may recall, was all about that and didn't get anywhere, not surprisingly. Well, 50 years later, we are in a very different situation. Instead of the diplomatie de carrière de doléances, we have what is known as collective financial statecraft, exercised by entities like the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, the New Development Bank, the position of the BRICS, a very different environment in which much of the wealth that used to be generated in the North Atlantic is now being generated in the Asia Pacific. My favorite statistic that I quote to my students, I'm teaching right now a course on North-South relations, is there are more billionaires in Beijing today than there are in New York City. If anybody would have said that 20 years ago that this would happen, he would have been laughed out of the room. But that is the situation in which we find ourselves. Now, in this context, non-alignment, active non-alignment has a very different meaning from what it did in the 50s and 60s. Here we have the global South speaking not from poverty, not from situations of being down and out, but from a situation in which the future is being forged in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America. That opens many possibilities for our countries. And it seems to me what we have seen in the past year after the invasion of Ukraine has been the emergence of this sense. Why do we need to follow the West's diktats? There is no reason for that, and you get, again, last week when I was in Pretoria, in South Africa, one of the underlying questions of Western diplomats regarding the very, ambivalent position that most African countries have taken on the war in Ukraine, where they have refused to back NATO, they have refused to back the G7 position, is the question that was posed: who lost Africa? The very posing of that question, which assumes that Africa belonged to someone that wasn't Africans themselves, tells you a bit about this curious perspective on, who owns the countries in the global South. And it seems to me that there's another very interesting question, and Professor Bryan mentioned the roots of non-alignment that also took hold so strongly in the Caribbean. One of the arguments that is posed in the book by Jorge Castañeda, the very distinguished public intellectual, political scientist, and former foreign minister of Mexico, he says that it is important to distinguish the situation of South America with that of the countries of the Caribbean basin, including Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. And his argument is that the countries in South America, because they are bigger, because they have more natural resources, because they are less closely intertwined with the US economy, have much more leeway to practice active non-alignment. than the countries of the Caribbean. And obviously, in the Caribbean basin, there are not just Caribbean, Central America, and Mexico as well. And there's no doubt a certain truth to that statement. Now, that said, what I find interesting, in looking back in my early years in Caribbean studies, I remember so well that in the 70s and 80s, a number of Caribbean countries played a key role in the non-aligned movement. Let us remember, Michael Manley and the role that Jamaica played in the NAM. Let us remember Guyana. Sridhar Rampal, a very noted diplomat and foreign minister. Let us remember, why not, Maurice Bishop and Grenada, the New Jewel movement that embraced non-alignment with great verve and brio. So it seems to me there's an interesting point there. Having taken Professor Castañeda's point about the difference between South America and the Caribbean basin, it is also true that history tells us that, contrary to that statement, the Caribbean has a long and distinguished tradition of embracing a non-aligned position. That's number one. The second point I would like to underscore, and this to me is extremely important, is that CARICOM nations have, despite the current difficulties they may face, they have one significant advantage, and that is their capacity to work together, their capacity to act as a body and bring to bear that diplomatic weight on international affairs. CARICOM has a degree of unity and a degree of interaction that not many other groupings of nations have. And so, despite the relative size of the members of CARICOM, acting as a collective entity, acting as a body, gives them an influence and opens possibilities that are far beyond the things they would otherwise imagine. And let me here bring to the fore what happened in the case of the Summit of the Americas that held in Los Angeles last June, in which, because a number of countries were excluded from that meeting, the initial position of CARICOM was that, well, it may not participate in the summit. Now, that changed at the end. A number of countries didn't, but it underscores my point that CARICOM nations have a degree of freedom and a degree of openness and possibility of charting its own course that is supported by their unity and by their possibility of collective action and working together, which gives them a great, it seems to me, a great advantage over regions that are not as united and do not work as strongly together. In those terms, and I will close with this, I don't want to take that much time. I find there's an interesting paradox here. The original non-aligned movement from which we take a page in our book was largely an Afro-Asian grouping. There were no Latin Americans in Bandung at the 1955 conference held in Indonesia, in which Nehru and Sukarno and Nasser played such a significant role. At the founding of the non-aligned movement in 1961 in Belgrade, the only Latin American was Fidel Castro. The only member was Cuba. That has changed over time, but it is still true that the NAM has had more of an Afro-Asian imprint, more of an Afro-Asian component than a Latin American one. That said, in this particular case, and in my recent participation in conferences, both in India and in South Africa, I find it interesting that in this occasion, it is Latin American countries that have taken the lead, as it were, at least conceptually, but also practically, in terms of bringing to the fore, once again, the issue of active non-alignment, active non-alignment, as we have called it. And I'm particularly pleased about this launch at the IIR, with which I have a long association. As you may remember, I was a very good friend and colleague and worked together with Professor Leslie Manninga who was with the Institute and later became president of Haiti, a great scholar, wonderful human being. And so I would like to underscore that it seems to me that the Caribbean can once again play a very significant role in this reemergence of non-alignment, this time in a new incarnation. We call it active non-alignment, which means a more dynamic, a more searching position that is constantly looking out for opportunities. It is easy to do as you are told. It is much more difficult to make choices on individual questions that come before you. And that is why active non-alignment demands a much more analytical and resourceful foreign policy than simply doing as you are told. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jorge. This is quite a bit of food for thought. It's wealth. You've explained the transitions, I think, and the fact that the center of gravity may have shifted in non-alignment towards this region of ours. It's an opportunity that we obviously should not lose. What I'd like to do now is ask several of the participants to take 10 or maximum 15 minutes to comment on the book and certainly on your delivery. Let me start with Dr. Jacqueline Laguarria Martinez, who is a lecturer, senior lecturer at the Institute of International Relations. She's also the coordinator of the master's and PhD programs at the Institute. And her research interest centers on Latin America, international relations, obviously in total. Jacqueline?
Yes. Hi, good morning, colleagues. I would like to start by thanking the invitation to share some comments to the book Latin American Foreign Policy in the New World Order, the Active Non-Alignment Option, edited by Professor Jorge Heine. I'm very pleased to have Professor Heine with us today, so welcome again. Carlos Fortin and Carlos Ominami. I knew about the Spanish version of the book published in 2021 under the title El No Alineamiento Activo y América Latina, una doctrina para el nuevo siglo. And I'm very pleased to see that there is an English version of this book that I believe will allow us to widen the discussion about the active non-alignment option as a valid strategy to consider not only in Latin America, but also in other regions of the Global South or the developing world. And I particularly believe that for the Caribbean, this is a good strategy to consider. The active non-alignment proposal is presented as an interesting foreign policy strategic option for Latin American countries in this book. And let us remember that historically, Latin American countries have shifted between positions of automatic alignment, pragmatic acquiescence, automatic alignment, peripheral realism, and other strategies like autonomy through participation or autonomy through diversification, among many others. The exercise of autonomy as a guiding principle in Latin American foreign policy and Latin American regionalism has been at the center of discussions since the foundation of Latin American states in the 19th century. To follow a logic of autonomy or acquiescence, to move between ideology and pragmatism, to deploy an equidistant diplomacy, as Tocatlia suggests in the book, is at the basis of the strategic options available to Latin American states, and it is an unfinished debate that reemerges from time to time depending on how severe the crisis affecting the region is. And it is very interesting to note that actually the book starts by stressing that the word crisis is inherent to Latin America. The COVID-19 pandemic aggravated the tense situation that the strained Latin American economies and public systems were already enduring. And now, in the context of progressive governments returning to most Latin American countries, the opportunity arises to reconsider alternative international relations projections. And this is where I believe the active non-alignment proposal is in a very good position to be considered. This is a new chance for Latin American leaders that might be more inclined to practice an assertive type of foreign policy to push for Latin American states to exert more agency and to increase their influence in multilateral fora and international organizations. And again, I would like to reinforce the importance of this book and the ideas contained in it. By assessing the prospects and challenges for Latin American governments of choosing and implementing the active non-alignment option, the authors necessarily address the key event that is transforming the current global order and forced to rethink alliances, positionings, and partnerships. As it is established at the beginning of the book, the active non-alignment option emerged as a response to the transfers of the world gravity center from the Atlantic to the Asia-Pacific, to the reconfiguration of the hyperglobalization model analyzed by Bárcena and Herreros, and to the escalating conflict between the United States and China, based on economic and technological competition, but also encompassing cultural and military dimensions. This is one relevant contribution of this book, to provide a comprehensive and multiple view of the US-China complex relationship, and to add a stimulating analysis around the topical debate about whether we are on the verge of a second Cold War. Another prevailing discussion in Latin America that comes and goes, describing pendular movement, and that is addressed by many of the authors in this book, is the state of Latin American regionalism, recognizing regionalism as a Latin American invention, as the book correctly reminds us. There is a consensus on the importance, perhaps today more than ever, of the necessity for Latin America to reinvigorate regional integration and cooperation as a strategy to advance Latin America's relevance and influence in global issues. After a vigorous period of regional initiative during the first years of the 21st century, we witnessed major setbacks in Latin American integration that resulted in CELAC declines, Mercosur's weakening, and the virtual dismantlement of UNASUR. A regional movement that translates into tangible benefits for Latin American societies, that outlives government shifts, that enhances regional positions vis-a-vis extra-regional partners, and that move away from a rooted mistrust in supranational arrangements is one of the factors that might facilitate the adoption of the non-alignment option. And at the same time, the decision of Latin American governments to embrace the active non-alignment strategy could boost integration and cooperation within the region. One of the merits I recognize in this book is that it revisits recent Latin American history as part of the Global South history. Of particular importance are the moments that retrace the origins and evolution of the non-aligned movement, the G77, UNCTAD, and the new international economic order. This historical recount is relevant not only to avoid misconceptions that could identify the active non-alignment option as a call for a non-alignment movement 2.0, but also to connect past events with current circumstances, to learn from failures, and to identify long-standing menaces against Latin Americans' capacity to deploy the minimum of autonomy in the exercise of foreign policy and to avoid subordination and full dependency from global powers. Latin America excels for its capacity to invent, to generate theories and policies, valid not only to understand and try to overcome the region's development challenges, but also to deal with the complexities of development in the Global South. The book reminds us about these capacities when touching on the circumstances of the post-war period and the atmospheres on the Cold War, and how Latin America pioneered the critics to Rostow's stage of modernization and articulated a regional response in industrialization by import substitution, inspired in the dependence theory, another Latin American creation that, as the authors point out, has been resurrected today by the United States. Latin America has significantly contributed to the post-world multilateral order. The active non-alignment proposal seeks to rescue this meaningful position in international affairs and make the region relevant again. Latin American foreign policies in the New World Order, the active non-alignment option, offers a rich palette of points of view from scholars, diplomats, and journalists actively involved in foreign policy making in the region. The book examines as well national experiences that confirms the diversity that coexists in what we call Latin America, and that warn us about different obstacles and possibilities for Latin American countries to move easily in an active non-alignment environment. I would like to congratulate all the authors and especially Professor Jorge Jaime, who is with us today for this book. I recommend it not only to researchers and students in the field of international relations, but also to Caribbean and Latin American audiences interested in knowing more about the region, our history, our possibilities to advance regional integration for the benefit of our societies, and to know more about the transformation, the major transformations that are already happening in the world as we know it. I thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. LaGuardia Martinez. Much food for thought there. Let me turn now for some comments from Professor Anthony Gonzalez. Anthony Gonzalez is, like myself, very much entwined with this institute over the years. For those of you who may not know this, this Institute of International Relations is 57 years old now. 57 years old, of which Anthony and myself probably account for a large proportion of those years. Dr. Gonzalez is a very distinguished economist in Trinidad and Tobago. He was director of this institute on several occasions, in between his postings in Geneva, Brussels, and God knows where else. But he continues to offer a great deal of commentary on social media and in conferences in Trinidad. So that I would ask Tony, if you will, or Peter, just simply to offer your remarks with respect to the book and with respect to Jorge's comments.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Bryant. All protocols observed. I would say, however, that I'm happy to see my dear colleagues, Dr. Montout in the driver's seat, Ms. Toussaint. It's rewarding to see that you're now back at the Institute as the permanent secretary. As you know, we at the Institute, we always take great pleasure in seeing our students rise. Professor Dukaran, it's again a pleasure to see you again after such a while. Ambassadors and other distinguished guests, let me begin by saying that I was very pleased to accept this invitation from the Institute to make a few comments. It's very difficult to comment on a book that is extremely broad and covers a wide range of interests. But however, I would say that the main purpose of the book was really to try to examine the relevance of the non-aligned concept, that is some notion of active non-alignment in the foreign policy of Latin American and Caribbean states, especially in a context where the world is moving towards some kind of Cold War, and I'll come back to that. And especially in a context as well, where Latin America has moved from what the book calls from being on the periphery to being marginalized. So that we're in a situation where Latin America needs to be involved in shaping this new environment that is emerging. That is to say that there are new powers in this in the South that have emerged along with Hello? Yes. Hello, are you hearing me? I think I got cut off. Hello? Yes.
We're
Hello?
hearing you, sir.
Yeah.
We are
yeah,
hearing you.
Okay, good. Yes, I saw my screen that as you got cut off. Yes, as I was pointing out, the book sees the urgent need for Latin America to try to establish itself as a region with a certain amount of power to negotiate the future emergence of the world order, a world order which has been embedded in liberalism and forged by the post-war powers to the detriment of Latin America. So a lot of emphasis is placed on regionalism and how regionalism should be built as a foundation for building that active non-alignment approach. The book also emphasizes the building of national capacity, and in that respect, there can be little argument with respect to its importance. I would suggest as well that maybe the examination of the non-alignment movement or what has become of it, along with probably other institutions like the G77. There's an author, for instance, that argues that the G77 should be revived to represent the global South today and as a good arm in strengthening the non-alignment movement. Now, this may be something that we in this part of the world can certainly use. So certainly something to think about. And as Professor Hine pointed out, we did in fact participate in the formation of the G77. Now, one of my main concerns with the book is the extent to which it may not have fully captured the changing world order. And that is more to say really the changing world disorder. That is to say we are living in a world today of much more disorder than order. And this is what multipolarity brings. Multipolarity increases the scope for non-alignment, but it has also brought a lot more disorder in the world. The whole world of the past was one controlled by two major superpowers that regulated the world. And they sat there and more or less ensured that conflicts were resolved and things were resolved. That world disappeared by the fall of the Berlin Wall. And in its place, we developed a kind of, some call it multiplex world, some call it a multipolar world. But in that world, you find there's a lot more disorder emerging. Yeah, where, for instance, one superpower, and this was tested when the United States tried to be the world's lone superpower, it discovered that even small powers, small, medium-sized powers, all in the Middle East, that it could not really control. I mean, look at the state of the Middle East. You have a lot of regional powers that are acting on their own and doing their own things and projecting power around the Middle East. So that multipolar role has brought a lot of conflict that wasn't there before. And in today's world, we have to place much more emphasis on order. So whether there will be a Cold War or not, and I want to come into this a little more, we have to place priority on getting some kind of order in the world. And this, in my mind, implies that there's a limits to which you can have strategic competition with China. If you examine, for instance, what is taking place in the American administration today, you would realize that there's still a lot of confusion as to whether there should be more cooperation or less cooperation with China, greater competition or less competition. There's still argument. For instance, you see in the transition from the Biden administration to from the Trump administration, you see them trying to hammer out this question of how much cooperation, how much competition, because they're very much aware of the fact that China is needed to regulate certain global commons such as assisting the developing countries to recover, issues like the pandemic, the whole question of nuclear proliferation, as well as certain, a very important one, which I almost forgot, the question of the environment. All these global issues today, not to mention that China probably would be needed in resolving some of these order issues, these global order issues. It makes a strategic competition very limited. That is to say that we cannot go back to where we were in the past with the Cold War, insofar as one needs just some kind of cooperation between these two large powers. So that my view somehow is that we needed to probably introduce a bit more clarity with respect to what will constitute that Cold War that we are talking about. Because in my mind, its intensity, in my view, is not very clear. We know that certainly, and I think the authors proceeded on the assumption that there's an economic dimension, certainly in trade. There's a technological dimension that we have spoken about, and we can see it with all the export controls and investment restrictions that the United States is placing. And certainly from that dimension, there's some competition. There's also the military aspect, which has to do with the Indo-Pacific and what the Americans are doing in building AUKUS and the Quad and all of that stuff and so forth. And we realize that, yes, there's a strategic dimension, but this doesn't necessarily mean that that could turn into some kind of extreme bipolar kind of competition, which could be disastrous for all of us. So I tend to feel that maybe some more precision was necessary in trying to define that Cold War, if indeed a Cold War is going to emerge. In my mind, I'm not very clear as to what that is, but what I would say that certainly the world is quite different than what it was years ago. And certainly multipolarity gives a certain kind of flexibility to third countries to play a much larger role in terms of their independence in foreign policy. We have a lot of intermediate powers today, and you see, for instance, a lot of them acting like Iran or in Venezuela and so forth, Turkey and so forth, which in a way provides a certain kind of flexibility to foreign policy. And in a sense, we see this emerging in Latin America. We see this in the foreign policies of Brazil, Argentina, Chile, just to give you some examples, where in a sense, they're already practicing some kind of non-alignment. And they have developed that capacity to do that, and they're using the way to try to exploit this kind of multipolar world. We see, for instance, Mexico talking about joining the BRICS, which is some indication it sees that flexibility in the world and how it can probably move with other countries to do that. So my position simply is that I'm not sure how far we can talk about some kind of, as the scientists tend to call it, entropic bipolarity, which means a kind of rigid bipolar conflict between the two large powers, similar to what we had in the old days between the Soviet Union and the United States. I'm not sure to what extent we can talk about that, although we do see emerging some greater competition between China and the United States. And certainly why I'm saying this is because up to now, I'm not clear that the President of the United States wants to talk about a Cold War. He keeps avoiding the term because I think he himself is not sure exactly of how far that would go. So I have some concerns here as to really the definition of the Cold War. I have some concerns also as to how we define the question of non-alignment. I think the authors agree that non-alignment is not equidistance, and certainly I agree with that. It's not, staying the same distance from each superpower. Neither is it kind of what they call double dependence. That is, you may stay equal distance, but you may be doubly dependent on each power. And I agree basically with that. And I guess what I took away from the book is that non-alignment basically means maximizing your national interest. And in that respect, I think there's one author on Argentina who tended to point out where the concern with the national interest is the basic tenet of this non-alignment movement, as Argentina has had to practice from the time of Perón and even before him in terms of the foreign policy, on which Professor LaGuardia had made an allusion to a while ago. So the question is, what kind of non-alignment in practice can we expect? And some of the authors point out, for example, that there will be tremendous variation across this hemisphere. One cannot expect those in the north, in the northern region here, for example, Mexico and the Caribbean, to have the same kind of non-alignment as those in the south, because we are much closer to the United States here. We have very strong economic, military and strategic ties with the United States. And as a result, our non-alignment that we may practice here may be slightly different, or would have to be different in many respects than the alignment of countries further south. So that in a sense, that variation needs to be sort of explored and developed much further. I was glad to see it mentioned, and I think certainly there's scope for exploring it much further. There are many dimensions of the book that one could go much further into. We don't have the time. The question of regionalism is certainly one, and I was glad to see there was a very useful article on regionalism and why Latin American regionalism has failed and what we need to really boost it. I think Latin America is the only region where you find lagging seriously in any kind of integration, and certainly that is needed as a basis for having some kind of active non-alignment. In the end, I would say that it's very hard to pin down this concept of active non-alignment. But essentially, what I take from it is that the authors are trying to establish some kind of greater independence in foreign policy for Latin American states. They would like to see Latin American states develop some more autonomy, and they would like to see them come together in order to be able to do that, to face the challenges outside there, challenges which have to do with building a new global order. And I fully agree with that. We need a new global model of governance in order for these countries to be able to develop in the future. The old global order has not really worked properly for them, and they need to join together with those who are emerging outside there to build that new global order. So in that sense, I welcome the book, and I welcome the idea of active non-alignment. And I interpret it in this sense as a kind of search for greater autonomy and independence in foreign policy making. So I will stop at this point. And there's a lot more that I could certainly say, but I think that's sufficient to spark up some kind of discussion. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. Obviously, I would want to ask Jorge Heine to take a few minutes to respond to some of the issues that were raised.
Thank you, Tony, if I may. Let me say the following. One of the things that has struck me the most in the feedback and the interaction we have had since the book came out, ever since the Spanish edition came out in November of 21, is the following. Our book was initially conceived as a bit of a manifesto, meaning we were calling for active non-alignment as a policy posture to be followed, given the depth of the Latin American crisis. I don't know whether you are aware that according to ECLAC, in 2020, Latin America experienced its worst economic downturn in 120 years. The global regional GDP fell by 6.6%, which was twice the GDP fall of the global economy. Latin America, with 8% of the world's population, experienced 30% of the world's deaths from the pandemic. These are very stark figures and illustrate the depth of the crisis, which is what led us to our proposal. Now, what I found very interesting is that in the reviews that came out of the book, including in journals such as Foreign Affairs, such as Global Policy, such as Foreign Policy, at least one of the reviewers said, this is not so much a manifesto, but this is basically a set of empirical findings. According to him, this is Brian Winter in Foreign Affairs, in his survey of Latin American foreign policy behavior in the course of the past few years. What he had found was exactly this, that Latin American countries were hedging their bets. They were not letting themselves be forced to choose between Washington and Beijing. This happened in the case of the pressures on Huawei, for example, the Chinese telecom company, where there was tremendous pressure not to allow Huawei to participate in 5G bids, and countries didn't accept those pressures and move forward. So again, the basic notion is here that this is not so much a manifesto as a recognition of things that are already happening. This is recognizing a certain type of foreign policy behavior. Now, this doesn't mean that governments call it that way. This is not a question of labels, but it's a question of actual behavior. And for example, this is fascinating. Perhaps the only thing in which there's been some continuity between the policies followed by President Bolsonaro in Brazil and the policies followed by President Lula, who succeeded him, is on the question of the war in Ukraine, in which Brazil took an independent stance under Bolsonaro and has taken an independent stance under President Lula. So that it seems to be is an important issue to keep in mind. On the question of the Second Cold War that my good friend, Professor Anthony Gonzalez has brought to the fore. It's a controversial issue. People have different views on it. But let me say the following. When we originally set forth the notion of a second Cold War in July of 2020, it was subjected to some criticism, and people said, this is not correct. We were told this is a trade war and a tech war, but it is not an ideological war, and it is not a military conflict like the first Cold War was. Well, that was in 2020. 3 years on, when various governments proclaim that this is the moment to choose between democracy and autocracy, what can be more ideological than that? I would say very few things. When expressions like the free world that was so popular in the 50s and 60s gain traction once again. And when we have, things like we saw in Taiwan on the occasion of the visit of Mrs. Pelosi, let alone what we are seeing in Ukraine now, the military dimension has also come to the fore. So we have not just a trade war, not just a tech war, we also have an ideological conflict, and we also have a military conflict in course. So, we may or may not, I don't particularly like the idea that we are in a second Cold War. I think the first Cold War brought, much suffering to Latin America, including to my own country, Chile, where, elected government was removed from office, among other things, because of the dynamics of the Cold War. So I do not necessarily like this. But, as an analyst, it seems to me, we're not in the business of liking or disliking things. We are in the business of identifying the factors that make for certain phenomena to occur or not. And I myself find very many coincidences between what the first Cold War was and what the second Cold War is. There are differences, of course. China is a much larger economy than the Soviet Union ever was. And its economy is, imbricated with the US economy in a way that the Soviet economy never was. Trade last year between China and the United States was $690 billion. No other two countries trade as much as the US and China. We also live in a highly interdependent global economy, which was not the case in the first Cold War. But those differences aside, I think the similarities are very important, and we ought to keep that in mind, whether we like them or not. I would argue that Latin America and the Caribbean went through a very difficult period during the first Cold War. I think things are not looking good right now. So the question is what to do. And what we argue very strongly is that the way forward is not by taking sides, not by saying we stand with Washington or with Beijing or with Brussels or with Moscow. The way forward is by, hanging together. And if we don't do that, we may very well hang separately. Thank you.
Once, time is our greatest enemy right now. So let me say that this discussion will go on clearly over a period of time. I think this is about your third or fourth webinar, let me put it that way,
right.
talking about the subject. Last one I saw was the one in South Africa a few days
Right.
ago,
That's right.
and I realized that you were in Pretoria.
That's right. That's right.
All right. Now, we want to bring this to a close, so I'm going to ask Professor Winston Dukaran to take a few minutes. He has a comment, and then I will move on to the closing remarks. You have some closing remarks? Right.
I'd say a deep sense of appreciation to Professor Hines for agreeing to include us in his global map, in which he's been very busy as he creates waves throughout the world on trying to bring some sense into an era of disorder. May I also say a special word of appreciation to our Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs and CARICOM Affairs for asking his permanent secretary to bring greetings here on his behalf, which is a reflection of the importance that he attaches to this particular conversation that is happening today here. When I was at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I turned to my permanent secretary here and I said, if you think that foreign affairs practice is exciting, you could see how the academic side of foreign affairs is just as exciting. And today we have had a fair share of that excitement. And I won't go into what has been said. I think it is all on the records now, and it's opened up a completely new discourse and conversation on this very important subject of foreign policy in the hemisphere, in the Caribbean, and certainly in the context of the world. When I did my own book some time ago called The Caribbean on the Edge, I included a small phrase in the epilogue, which said, a book rarely stands on its own. It comes from somewhere and sometimes travels unknown paths. I think that might be apt to this book that Professor Hines and his colleagues have put together today. What are the unknown paths ahead of us? It will be an open page for some time, but it will reflect itself in different forums. For the teachers of diplomacy, it will look critically at the conduct of that diplomacy in the Caribbean context. We have always been subject to the charge that our communiques after heads of government meeting have always reflected the doctrine of ambiguity. Small nations tend to find solace in ambiguity in trying to respond to global divides. This book is going to add to that ambiguity. It is going to ensure that we find some concreteness on the issues before us in the context of that ambiguity, which has been part of a tradition, notwithstanding our general trust towards non-alignment in the early days of the formation of our own foreign policy in the region. So that's a point for the teachers who will now add that to the reading list as they begin to study how diplomacy is going to change. The other point that emerged out of this discussion and perhaps out of this book is the substantial issue of policy, and in particular, the issue of regionalism. A lot of pages in this book and a lot of reference has been made here today on the issue of regionalism, whether it is driving force of the future or a receding force of the future. And I think that's a critical issue that has emerged, because foreign policy is not a reflection of a position for its own intrinsic value, but a reflection of the economic prospects of a country. And in that sense, regionalism will take a new shape. And in that sense, I believe the foreign policy that will emerge out of the changes in the economic landscape will dictate the future. I have always argued that integration have been laid on a very static set of pillars. And perhaps the time has come for a new form of collaboration among nations, within the region, and between the region and elsewhere, on what I call the convergence of economic forces. So that's an issue of policy, I think, that will emerge. And the third issue that I thought I should raise is really the practice of foreign policy. A lot has been said. Both of our commentators, Dr. Jacqueline Lagardia and Professor Anthony Gonzalez, have spoken at length on the existence or the exercise of autonomy on one hand, and on the clarity for the definition of what is the global disorder. I think they have put, as lecturers, as professors, they have put their finger on what will in fact be the outcome of many more work in this regard. For we need, therefore, in this exercise, to define, as Professor Hines said, foreign policy in a more analytical context, to be able to define it so that it can achieve the goals of economic change and the goals of economic choices that have to be made. And in that sense, it's not the pursuit of a particular policy that matters, but it's the effectiveness of that policy in solving our own particular problems that we have, particularly in the economic and international relations field. So these are some of the things that I reflect on, and I think a lot has been said here today. I thank those who have contributed to the beginnings of that debate. I say to Dr. Montu, our interim director, a special word of appreciation for her persistent support in making this happen here today, and to the Institute of International Relations for once more putting the ball in the court of the academicians and the students, so that the policymakers will engage in a discussion, a fertile discussion on the options in foreign policy that we will have to encounter. We don't know what that path is going to be, but we do know that that path is going to change. We do know that the global order must be rebuilt in a better way. We do know that the liberal order has had its usefulness and has probably come to an end of its useful life. But we do not know what that better order is going to be. We are therefore at a very vantage position as practitioners, as lecturers, to be able, in our ideas and in our research and in our procrastinations about the future, be able to shape that better order. A small step, but an important step. And I finally say a word of thanks to you, Professor Brian, for coming and sharing this. It brings me back to the good old days when you used to chair with such excitement all these meetings. You have done it again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Winston. Well, time has run out, but we have one final, what should I say, item to discuss. Well, not to discuss, but really, His Excellency David Francisco Malaga of the Embassy of the Republic of Peru would like to offer a toast.
Thank you, Professor Brian. Ms. Tute. Thank you very much for convening to this conference, and it is just a toast with Peruvian Pisco, and wishing you and wishing you all the best in the launching of your book, Dr. Heine. Thank you very much.
Well, Jorge, there you have it. We're all going to get a little inebriated on Pisco. Put on your microphone.
Too bad I cannot share it myself. Thank
To
you,
you,
Ambassador.
Thank you, everyone, for your attendance, those of you online, and certainly those of you here in the boardroom. This has been indeed a privilege. And all I would want to say finally is that 3 outstanding Chilean scholars and practitioners of international relations have assembled in this book a really international symposium about how to go forward for states of ours. It's a fantastic contribution, Jorge, and thank you, fellow authors.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Thank you.
With online things, can interact after.
Yeah.
There's abilities of more like virtual. I think there's a more virtual reality.